This is Homeschool 101, a collaboration between ABS Television and the Ministry of Education. Stay attentive and attempt all activities. And now, today's lesson.
Welcome to Homeschool 101. My name is Nikisha Smith, and I'll be teaching you Caribbean Studies today. We'll be tackling a subject from Module 1 of the syllabus, Caribbean Global Interactions. And just for a short summary of what the topic is about, it's how they influence us and how we influence them. So in completing this section, you'll be able to explain how imperial and colonial policies influence Caribbean society and culture, describe neo-colonial and post-colonial aspects of Caribbean society and culture, assess how the identity of Caribbean people have been influenced by colonialism, discuss the influence of the consumption patterns, creative expression, politics, sports, and tourism of extra-regional countries on the Caribbean, and finally analyze the impact of the Caribbean on extra-regional societies using examples drawn from politics, economics, creative expression, religion, and the culinary arts. Let's get started. So the first thing we have to do is define some terms. So we all know what regional is. So it's relating to or coming from a particular part of a country or a particular part of the world. Extra means outside or in addition to. So if we put those two words together, we're going to get extra-regional, which means outside of a particular part of the world or region, and in this case, it's going to be the Caribbean. So it's outside of the Caribbean. So this section will explore the nature of the influences from outside the region on the Caribbean and within the region to the rest of the world. This section will explore the nature of the influences from outside the region on the Caribbean and within the region to the rest of the world. So now we're going to start with Caribbean influences on extra-regional countries. So in this case, how we influence them. So this is about pre-emancipation or before 1834. So pre-emancipation would have been when the slaves were freed. And so pre-emancipation, the biggest contribution of the Caribbean to the rest of the world was sugar and rum, because that was what the region principally produced. This evolution of taste and demand for sugar as an essential food ingredient resulted in major economic and social changes. So sugar drove the slave trade and indentureship. It became a sign of wealth and completely changed the culinary landscape of the world. In some documentaries, they even say before this, people never had dental problems. But when sugar was introduced to the world, that's when people started to get tooth decay. That's how much sugar changed the world. Plus, the profits from the sale of these goods, sugar and rum, developed the places like Liverpool and London and the other colonizer countries, such as France, Holland, and Spain. This is an example of how sugar was produced. Now, post-emancipation or after emancipation, 1834, the Caribbean influenced the rest of the world through economics. And the first point we'll be going through is migrant labor. So with the onset of the construction of the Panama Railroad in 1850, which is Central America, thousands of Caribbean West Indians began to migrate en masse in search of a better life, because these were now ex-slaves who did not want to work on plantations anymore. However, they had to find means they had to find an income, and so therefore this provided a good opportunity, especially for young males. So Caribbean West Indians went to Panama in the 1850s to help build the railroads, and an even larger wave began to arrive in the 1880s to begin this construction on the canal. By 1888, the labor force numbered about 20,000, 9/10 of them Afro-Caribbean workers from the West Indies. They were lured by the opportunity of lucrative work and the promise of wealth, but they were faced with appalling living conditions, disease. In this case, it was things like malaria and yellow fever, and of course, rugged terrain, because literally they had to dig through rock in order to create the path for the canal. In 1920, 6 years after the completion of the canal, authorities estimated that there were 70,000 West Indians in Panama. And if you ask your grandparents, you might be able to determine that maybe even they have someone or a relative, or maybe even themselves, who actually went to work on the canal during that time. Some other areas that migrant labor went to were Canada and the US. So these governments allowed temporary migrant workers to pick fruit in Canada and Florida. These economies are very dependent on Caribbean workers to harvest fruits before winter. Increasing from the 1990s, however, you have teachers, nurses, and other healthcare professionals who are actively recruited to fill growing vacancies in those areas, to which nationals are not attracted to, or they're in short supply. So Caribbean people continue to impact on the economy of developed countries by providing an educated and willing workforce. We see here someone who's picking oranges in Florida, and this is a nanny who works with a family to raise children. After World War II, many African Caribbean people migrated to North America and Europe, especially to the United States, Canada and United Kingdom, France and the Netherlands. As a result of the losses during the war, the British government in particular began to encourage mass immigration from the countries of the British Empire and Commonwealth to fill shortages in the labor market. Because as we would know from World War II, there were mass losses in lives, lots of infrastructural damage from the bombs that went off. So there was a lot of rebuilding that had to take place. The Windrush generation refers to the immigrants who were invited to the UK between 1948 and 1971 from Caribbean countries such as Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, and yes, Antigua and Barbuda. The name derives from the ship MV Empire Windrush, which on June 22nd, 1948, docked in Tilbury, Essex, bringing nearly 500 Jamaicans, mostly men, and this will become significant later on, to the UK. They worked in foundries, on the railways, as builders, as farm workers, and as electricians. So these are some pictures of the Windrush migrants, and this would have been between the period of 1948 to 1971. So as you can see, they were very well dressed, lots of people, and they were housed in some conditions when they arrived. This is a modern day picture of the Windrush generation. They were involved in some protests. We'll discuss this later on. So we're continuing with how the Caribbean influences the rest of the world. Economically, festivals. So large populations of Caribbean migrants in New York, London, and Toronto have created a tradition of carnival celebrations, which are attended by thousands. These festivals boost the local economies in those countries through hotel bookings, tax on entertainment services, the food industry, and provide work in producing costumes and organizing aspects of the festivals. So some examples: Notting Hill Carnival in England generated £93 million and 3,000 full-time jobs in 2003. Caravana in Toronto generated Canadian $438 million in 2019. And the Labor Day Parade, or West Indian Carnival in Brooklyn, New York, attracts millions of visitors and millions in revenue. Another area that we contribute economically is through offshore banking. The Cayman Islands, Bahamas, British Virgin Islands, Turks and Caicos, Anguilla, and Antigua and Barbuda offshore economies catering largely to clients abroad. These clients are mainly interested in tax avoidance in metropolitan countries. So we are effectively tax-free havens. Another way that the Caribbean influences the world economically is through trade. Because most Caribbean countries do not have sufficient arable land to feed their populations, much of our food comes from abroad, and the United States is the largest supplier of food products into the region. There's also a very large demand for consumer products like cell phones from the US. For example, in 2012, consumer goods worth almost 880 million were exported to the region, which represented a 6% increase from the previous year. The state of Florida, which does the shipping, most of its trade with the Caribbean, and this supplies tens of thousands of jobs in that country. So thus, any threat to the stability of the Caribbean should be of concern to the US. Should be. Another area is through music. Music is now considered to be a commodity. It can be bought and sold. And so the popularity of Caribbean music styles like reggae, dancehall, and soca in Western countries has led to a mutually beneficial relationship where the hosts of festivals hire Caribbean artists to perform at their festivals. So only reggae, steel pan, and the culture of the Rastafari have made a real breakthrough into the mainstream cultures of the US and European markets. The markets for Caribbean music remain tied to members of the Caribbean diaspora. So that means Caribbean people who move to these metropolitan areas, they want to experience their Caribbean music, and so festivals are organized to give them that sense of home. Another area of Caribbean influence on extra-regional countries would be through politics. So the influence of the Caribbean on extra-regional countries in relation to politics revolves around questions of immigration. Persons from the Caribbean tend to move to North America and Europe in times of economic downturn, natural disaster, and political instability. So for decades, the US has had an open door policy for Cuban migrants. In an effort to undermine Castro's regime, US governments offered asylum to any Cuban reaching US territory. So therefore, large numbers of Cubans left for the US after the 1959 revolution. They mainly stayed in places like Florida, where they have a huge community. So the Cuban-American lobby is second in importance to the Israeli-American in US politics. They have already spoken with one voice, fought for one cause, the overthrow of Castro. So Cubans hold offices in state, local, and federal governments. They represent a significant voting bloc in South Florida. Another country that has a significant migrant population is Haiti. Since 1972, people from Haiti have also been finding their way to the United States by both official and unofficial channels. This continues today. In the wake of the Haiti earthquake of 2010, many Haitians that were displaced by the disaster also made the journey. The Haitian population is scattered mainly across Florida, Miami, and Boston. Their political impact is limited largely because they are divided along class lines. You have the professionals who speak French, and then the working class who speak Creole, which is the Creole language of Haiti. In Miami, Haitians act as a voting bloc. The issue of the boat people, quote unquote, has been used to mobilize the Haitian community. In 1982, the Haitian Refugee Center brought a class action suit against the US government that was successful in winning release on parole of 1,900 detainees. Another political influence happened because of the Windrush generation that we spoke about earlier. The Notting Hill race riots occurred in London at the end of August 1958, just 10 years after the Windrush docked. They were anti-black riots where the whites were protesting the presence of the immigrants who were taking their jobs, and this was also said they're women because they were mainly young black men who, after they finish work, as young men do, they're going to be looking for love. And so therefore the only women that were around were white women. So the society at that time didn't like the mixing of races. The riots caused tension between the Metropolitan Police and the British African Caribbean community, which claimed that the police had not taken their reports of racial attacks seriously. A scandal over the treatment of members of the Windrush generation has been mounting since 2018, as a multitude of reports have come out about mostly elderly people being denied services, losing their jobs, and even facing deportation. Many of the Windrush generation had arrived as children on their parents' passports, so they did not have their own passports when they entered England. And so they are considered not to be citizens of Britain. And although they have lived in Britain for many decades, paying their taxes and insurance and getting married, having kids, they never formally became British citizens. So the year of 2020 began with a number of deportations from England of some of those persons, particularly those who had been imprisoned at some point in time. Another way that the Caribbean influences extra-regional territories is through the culinary practices. To people in extra-regional countries, Caribbean cuisine represents one more type of ethnic food that any metropolitan center offers. Migrant communities support their restaurants and markets to enjoy the food from home. And so you'd have things like curries, rice and peas, saltfish, jerk meats, coconut milk, and highly seasoned foods that are slowly being known to non-Caribbean people. An example is, there is a brownies bakery in New York City that is very successful, and that is spreading the appeal of Antiguan-style bread to non-Caribbean people. Another way that the Caribbean has influenced extra-regional countries is through religion. So Rastafari has gone global. At the same time, major religions like Roman Catholicism and Anglicanism are going through a creolizing process. And that means they're mixing and matching cultures to create something that's new. So practices such as clapping, the use of steel pans, drumming, and a great deal of music of the folk variety are not typical of the mainstream Christian services in Europe. And so Caribbean people have added that extra flavor, and so that has changed the religious services which have originated in Europe. Another area of influence on the world is through sport. And now we're taking a look at cricket. The 1980s West Indies cricket team introduced the world to fast bowling. The batsmen of the other teams were scared to face the Windies team bowlers at that time. They troubled the batsmen because they were so tall. They extracted good bounce from every type of wicket. And then fast bowling techniques have now been incorporated into the cricket world as a result of what those Caribbean cricketers did at that point in time. Another area of influence is track and field. Caribbean athletes are most successful in track and field. They've won a number of gold medals and silver and bronze. So world-class athletes from the region compete at the highest levels of international competition, including at the Olympics and World Championships. For example, now Usain Bolt currently holds the fastest records in the men's 100-meter and 200-meter races. Jamaica has the fastest men's 4x100-meter record, and Melanie Walker has the women's 400-meter hurdle record. Right here we have a picture of Vivian Richards from Antigua and Barbuda, one of the greatest batsmen who have ever lived. And also we have a picture here of Usain Bolt winning one of his many gold medals. Now we're going to move on to how the world affects us, the Caribbean. So this is extra-regional influences on Caribbean society. So the first area we're going to look at is imperialism and colonialism. The age of imperialism began with the coming of the Europeans who conquered lands and peoples and established colonies. These imperial powers ruled their subject peoples through a combination of military might, fear, and deliberate psychological conditioning, promoting the European as the superior person of culture. Example, there were laws showing that slaves could not own land, they could not wear silk, or be on the road after a certain point in time. So with the exception of Haiti, which was liberalized in 1791, all Caribbean countries were subject to centuries of cultural conditioning into Eurocentric attitudes and values. So colonialism was a period during which European culture was promoted, and the culture of the Amerindian, African, and Indians were treated as, quote-unquote, the other. Connected to this is neo-colonial and post-colonial societies. Connected to this is the neo-colonial and post-colonial societies. So the Caribbean is now in its post-colonial era, that means after colonialism, and this is due to many countries gaining independence. However, many question whether the relationship between the colonizer or the ex-colonizer and the colonized has changed. Our political, education, religious, and judicial systems, our sports, our dress, and trading patterns all show an orientation towards the metropole. That means the former colonizers. So indigenous efforts have had to struggle to gain legitimacy. Example, things such as Rastafari or the game of Wari, or they have been virtually ignored. Example, or other languages, for example, other than English, African languages, or maybe Indian languages, so on and so forth. The Caribbean economy has been infiltrated with multinational corporations with their headquarters in the metropole and without any serious allegiance to the Caribbean, which is troubling. So we have hotels, ICTs, companies, fast food, banks, all those companies that pretty much make up Caribbean life, but they do not originate here. The debt burden of Caribbean countries has seen the economies at the mercy of multinational, multilateral agencies like the IMF and the WTO, which are controlled by the metropole and on which Caribbean countries have little to no political sway over. So even though we are part of the World Trade Organization grouping, Caribbean countries do not have much of voting power and therefore little say. So post-colonial society, again, post means after colonialism, is a term used to describe how these neo or new colonial relationships of continued dominance and subjugation affect people in the ex-colonies. So these are terms that you have to remember in Caribbean studies. Neo-colonial means new colonial. Post-colonial means after colonialism, means in the era of independence. And post-colonial society means how these colonial relationships continue today despite our independence. Another area of extra-regional influence on Caribbean society is through our trade and consumption patterns. As mentioned before, a high percentage of the goods and services consumed in the Caribbean originate in Western countries, and Western would include places like Europe and the US and Canada, particularly the US. As a consequence, our production and manufacturing sectors are very small scale and suffer competition from imports, which are heavily subsidized by their governments to be cheap. Some examples are potatoes and milk. Colonial policy deliberately fostered a skewed economic relationship by prohibiting manufacturing and encouraging dependency. So the colonies were never expected to be self-sufficient. They were always supposed to import whatever they needed from the mother colony. And that relationship continues today. So according to post-colonial theory, consumption patterns therefore reflect a mindset privileging Western values and Western products. So in terms of consumption patterns, some things are the value in believing what is foreign is better. And then we question, is this a form of self-hate? Some people would say, if it's made locally, they don't trust it. They question its quality. Another fact is the extreme importance associated with being modern. Example, having the latest phone. So instead of, if the phone is working normally, quite fine, people would say, I have to have what's the latest thing in order to feel good. Another thing is we focus on the products associated with the Western world because it helps us to build social capital, meaning it makes us look good to our neighbors, friends, and family. So associating with certain brands and designer labels which originate in the West. For example, young boys always say they must have their Adidas or their Nikes or Versace bags. Well, that's for women, things like that. And then, of course, we have the United States is the center of the world. For example, having a US visa is a status symbol. Sometimes we don't even intend to travel to the US, but we still apply for visas. Why? Why do we feel that we need to be able to go to this country? Another area of extra-regional influence on Caribbean society is through migrant remittances. So post-emancipation, there has been a lot of migration out of the Caribbean to find work and get a better life. It is a normal practice for these workers to send home remittances or money to assist family members. So these remittances also constitute a valuable source of foreign exchange for the home country as they have been done for decades. So for example, the Dominican Republic receives most remittances in the region. They have 4.6.5 billion US dollars being sent back to their country, and that was in 2014. Second is Jamaica. They received 2.6 billion US dollars, and then following them, that is Haiti with 1.9 billion US dollars. The Lesser Antilles region, of which the Antigua and Barbuda is one, received 12.7 billion US dollars in 2018, but that's a combination of several different countries. And of course, the way that this is usually done is through companies like Western Union. Another way that extra-regional influences on Caribbean society is through creative expression and art forms. So Caribbean art forms have strong extra-regional influences, particularly those of the European colonizers. So you have festivals, so the Christian observance of Christmas and Easter, secular celebrations like Valentine's Day, Halloween, even Carnival originated in Europe, set to occur before Lent. And if we look at the name, Carnival means remove meat, because carne means meat. In the area of theater art, you have plays, dramatic performances, pantomimes, and musical productions. These are all modeled on British or American theaters. The themes, however, are uniquely Caribbean, such as nationhood, decolonization, liberation, etc. In the area of visual arts, artists and sculptors are trained in the same methods as their Western counterparts, such as in the use of watercolor, ceramics, etc. But the content is usually Caribbean in nature as well. Music. Reggae was strongly influenced by traditional mento, which is a celebratory rural folk form in Jamaica, as well as American jazz and rhythm and blues, which are also from America. Especially the New Orleans R&B practiced by Fats Domino and Alan Toussaint. And that combination of influences evolved out of the earlier genres of ska and rocksteady. So reggae had its evolutionary journey. Another way that the world has affected the Caribbean is our educational system. So this curriculum in the Caribbean is still centered on academic disciplines as they were handed down to the Caribbean from the UK system of education, such as English, math, biology, chemistry, etc. The language in which we're educated, the struggle of legitimizing Creole continues. So in the Anglophone Caribbean, children are taught correct English, but the first language that they're exposed to is actually Creole, which is our local dialect. And that creates confusion in the minds of our learners. Only Haiti has both French and Creole, it's Creole, as official languages and teach both of them equally in schools. Caribbean countries have bought into the United Nations vision of education for all, a reform movement that was born out of a concern for development where all persons should have some form of education, whether it is formal, informal, or vocational. That means they learn a skill. Another area that the world has affected the Caribbean is through politics. The Westminster system of government, where we have the upper house, lower house, constituency, elections, and prime ministers, etc., is the system of government which is most popular in the Caribbean. The regional security system, which is a collective body of security for the Caribbean region, particularly the Eastern Caribbean. This has relied on US and British intelligence expertise and resources in developing the system. They patrol Caribbean waters and carry out maneuvers. There was also US involvement in Caribbean politics in post-Cuban revolution when the US government put an embargo on Cuba so that they could not import goods or be associated with different countries in the Caribbean. That lasted for a very long time. And of course, US involvement was also evident in Operation Urgency Fury, where Grenada was invaded with US troops in the 1980s. So in conclusion, the Caribbean has been embroiled in a relationship with Western countries since the 15th century. This was when Columbus discovered the region. So all aspects of Caribbean society and culture under colonialism and afterwards has been influenced in significant ways because of this relationship. In the aftermath of independence, Caribbean people have tried to resist this influence in various ways. We have our novelists, we have scholars who do their research, performances, artists who sing their songs, musicians, entrepreneurs, sportsmen and women who are trying to overcome. Globalization continues to bring ex-colonizers and the colonized together in a neo-colonial association where now the flow of the influence has been reversed to an extent. This has been another episode of Homeschool 101. Thank you for watching.
You've been watching Homeschool 101, a partnership between ABS Television and the Ministry of Education. Thank you for viewing this lesson. Join us again next time.